debate team and president of its psychology club and president of its chess team. He has presented on a diversity of topics, including epistemological systems in Zen philosophy, philosophy of art, normative power structures in zombie media, anthropocentrism and ableism in psychology, adults' cognitive strategies for solving fractions and event-related potential, or ERP, measures of partial word knowledge in children, and he is currently interested in communication studies, critical animal studies, activism, and neurolinguistics. So for each panel presentation, the presenter will have between 20 to 25 minutes. Then when that presentation is completed, the next presentation will go, and we'll just save all questions until the very end, if you don't mind. All right, so with that said, Caleb, you may begin. Can you hear us?
I can. How is the sound quality? Am I too loud, too soft?
What do you think? Sounds good. Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. And did you say I had 20 minutes to present?
Yes, 20 to 25 or so, yes.
20 to 25, sounds good. All right, one moment. All right, well, thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited to do this. I'm sorry I can't be here in person. This was the one conference I really wanted to go to. It seemed so exciting, but unfortunately I couldn't get the funding for that. So I appreciate you bearing with me through the magic of technology. So let's see if I can get this to work. All right, do you see a slideshow?
Yes. Yes.
Yes, perfect. All right. Do you see changes?
Yes.
All right, perfect. All right, well, thank you very much. I guess I'll just go ahead and get started then. I thank you so much for the little background information. It must seem very strange. Zombies and psychology and philosophy of art. I'm a little all over the place. For this one in particular, though, I think this really touches on the things I've been working through in my undergraduate career. I'm a psychology major. I'm also a philosophy major. This is a little bit of philosophy of psychology, but it has to do with a particular aspect of psychology called Morgan's canon. Now, Morgan's canon, I think, is very important for animal ethics, but I haven't seen a ton of literature on that so far. I think that's something that's been very critical in our investigations of psychological studies. So that's what got me started on Morgan's canon. But before I begin my presentation, there are a few ethical concerns. The main one really is the fact that I am citing animal studies where the animals were quite possibly captured, seriously injured, or killed. And I say likely because whenever you're studying an animal study, you don't really know the background information on that. So there are some ethical concerns with citing these sources and legitimizing them. However, I don't mean to legitimize them or condone them in any way. I hope through this presentation that I'll be able to expose the certain mechanisms that have helped facilitate these atrocities in the first place. So first, has anyone heard anything in particular about animal minds? Maybe from a psychological article, maybe on BuzzFeed. I mean, some of you are researchers. Have you ever used psychological studies in any of your research?
Yes.
Yes.
No? Yes?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
Yes. That's fine. So there are some interesting facts about non-human animals that I've seen all across both the psychological realm as well as for the animal cognition realm. Some interesting facts include the fact that cuttlefish can change their coloration in a matter of seconds. Crows can recognize particular human faces for weeks and possibly even months. I know I can't remember a face for more than 10 seconds. Both of those seem very impressive to me. So there's all sorts of impressive things that we can, that psychologists have found out about non-human animal minds. But now, why do we care about those in particular? Well, one thing I think is it helps guide our methods of thinking through empathy and sympathy. This is a quote from Philip Mockingbird. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his or her point of view, until you climb into his or her skin and walk around with it in it. I think that's particularly true of critical animal studies. But more than that, the assumptions we make about non-human animal minds can affect at least the rhetoric of our research, our everyday ethical decisions, and our activism. On the right, you see a poster from PETA, which makes assumptions about non-human animal minds. It says, if you could see or feel the suffering, you wouldn't think twice, give back life, don't eat meat. So those are based on the assumption that we are trying to empathize or sympathize, and it's based off of a particular kind of knowledge from the non-human animal's mental perspective, their ability to suffer, their ability to think. So, what if I told you that every psychological estimation of non-human animal intelligence were consistently wrong? All of it, absolutely. And that many researchers know about it. This comes from a particular mechanism that psychologists have used for about 100 years called Morgan's canon. And every psychological article uses Morgan's canon in some way or another. Morgan's canon states that in no case is an animal activity to be interpreted in terms of a higher psychological process if it can be interpreted in terms of processes which stand quote, lower in the scale of psychological evolution and development. Now, contemporary researchers have interpreted this principle to mean that non-human animal minds should be considered as unsophisticated, as simple as possible. So the question that started me on this research was why? Why is this particular mechanism used? Morgan's canon is used throughout animal psychology, but the focus of it does not seem to be directed towards a scientific accuracy, meaning that the assumptions we're supposed to make is striving towards an unsophisticated animal mind, but that doesn't mean an accurate depiction of animal minds. So why do scientists follow this principle? Why does it exist? To answer this question, I am going to talk about three different aspects. One, the historical context of the original usage of the canon, the contemporary usage of the canon, as well as possible alternatives inspiring the canon. So first, through the historical aspects of it, C. Lloyd Morgan wrote his canon as an alternative to the typical methods that researchers use to study non-human animal minds. At the time, researchers tended to follow Occam's razor, which suggests that the simplest of two equal explanations should be preferred. It's a principle also called parsimony. And at the time, it was considered most parsimonious to claim that identical behaviors in different animals had identical proximate mental causes. For example, you could see a very brave zebra next to a lion, and they're both drinking from water. The simplest explanation, according to this version of parsimony, is that both the lion and the zebra have a particular kind of mental state, and that would be thirsty. So those two mental states are similar. Now, Darwin and Romanes would often describe non-human animals as having those mental states that are similar to humans, which they were most intimately familiar with. For example, they would say that dogs are happy, happy being a state of mind that humans are familiar with, and that they interpreted the non-human animal, the dog, also having. Now, this led to a bunch of other claims that researchers today would definitely wince at, such as that animals have the ability to reason, to self-reflect, more controversially, to experience aesthetics, or even to believe in God. So here are some particular examples of quotations. The terrier, Darwin suggested, demonstrated delight, that dogs and jackals experience pleasure, that they also show delight. The next quotation suggests that, this is a very famous one, that a dog would be jealous of his, quote, master's affection, that dogs exhibit a high degree of self-complacency and pride. Lloyd Morgan believed that following parsimony in this particular way could lead to an anthropomorphic bias, a bias that interprets non-human animals as having too many similarities to human animals. So he wrote his canon to partially counteract this bias. Now, usually the story that they tell you in introduction to psychology class will stop there. However, I found out after researching that there's a little more to it than that. Following Morgan's canon can create a new type of bias called anthropodenial, which they Wall coined that term in 1999. Now, anthropo denial is the underestimation of the similarities that humans and non-humans experience. So Morgan's canon, although it fixes a particular type of bias, it has a new type of bias in the other hand, so they're sort of counterbalanced. So if Morgan's canon doesn't fix bias overall in science, then why did Morgan write it in the first place? Well, there are three possible reasons that I have discovered for why Morgan wrote this canon. I say I discovered, but that I researched. One is that he believed that non-human animals couldn't reason because they have no language. He's influenced by his contemporary Mueller, as well as his not contemporary Locke. The second assumption was that he believed that evolution progresses from simple organisms to complex organisms. And he also believed that animals can have simple mental mechanisms without having complex mental mechanisms, but the reverse could not be true. The strange thing about it is that today we know that all three of these assumptions are flawed. That's uncontroversial. We found over and over again that non-human animals are capable of all sorts of reasons, even in the absence of language. We've also found suggestions that certain non-human animals communicate in ways very similar to what we would call language. We know that evolution does not progress from simple to complicated. The simplest organisms, of course, develop more complex organisms because they had nowhere to go but more complex. But now we find that organisms can become simpler as well as more complex. And the belief that simple mechanisms can be present without complex mental mechanisms, but not vice versa, is on the one hand vague, but on the other hand, we found that not to be true in several animals. So, considering that, why would we be using that today? Why would researchers who agree that those assumptions are false be using it? Well, first let's talk about how Morgan's canon operates. There are several contentious topics in non-human animal psychology, such as their ability to have metacognition, theory of mind, self-awareness, cognition, consciousness. All of these topics are very important for researchers who are going to be investigating ethics for non-human animals. So, most contemporary researchers still follow Morgan's canon, and I would add that even the ones who don't are in some way influenced by previous research that also followed the strict Morgan's canon. Now, unfortunately, the canon itself has several major problems. One of which is that non-human research has unique limitations, which makes Morgan's canon worse than no canon whatsoever. Some of these limitations include the fact that there are far, far more psychological studies on humans. Non-human animals can't self-report their thoughts or feelings in a very clear way to researchers. And it's difficult for researchers to interpret MRI, PET, EEG scans without any self-report. We can recognize the patterns, but we don't really know what those patterns signify, except insofar as the parallel human patterns in EEG scans. Also, human researchers double as captors, which makes, because of these power dynamics, any ecologically valid research difficult. And also, humans have a difficult time identifying the appropriate research questions for non-humans than with humans. So because of these limitations relative to humans and also overall, we know very little about non-human animals. And this is problematic because Morgan's canon requires researchers to assume that non-human animal minds are as unsophisticated as possible, so that research tends to greatly underestimate non-human animal minds. Morgan's canon forces researchers to prove each mechanism of the non-human animal mind. And if we know very little information, then our overall depiction of it would be very, very unsophisticated. Now, not only is this bad for scientific accuracy, but it causes people to underestimate the quality of non-human animals' mental experiences, and including their suffering. So hopefully, you should see on the screen a picture of two rats. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes? Perfect. All right. This was a quotation by someone named Ramon. It was in 2001. He suggested that non-human primates don't feel pain. It's a very controversial claim, even within psychology, but he suggested yes, non-human animals avoid pain, certainly, There's chemical reactions that indicate pain. They try to protect themselves and families. All those indications are pain, but we haven't had sufficient proof that they suffer for it. We don't know that. We can't prove that. And because of Morgan's canon, he said, something we can't prove, we therefore must assume doesn't exist. So this was at the end of his paper, rejoice, rejoice, for there is far less non-human animal suffering than our anthropomorphic minds are inclined to believe. Now at this point, it starts to get very hard for me. This particular box is the way our psychology department at Mercer kills the rats. I've seen that myself, and I also know many of the rats. So there are some immediate ethical consequences of Morgan's canon. I've identified two of them here. One is it helps researchers justify their experiments. That is, the experiments help perpetuate other experiments. Something at the end of every psychological article you can see is more research is needed. And that same idea is what allows them to prove that non-human animals can be harmed while holding to this canon. Now, secondly, and more broadly, it participates in the construction of anthropocentrism, in which human concerns eclipse others' concerns. Now, that being said, why do researchers still follow Morgan's canon, knowing these particular problems? I found several suggestions. The first is sexism. Anthropomorphism is oftentimes associated with sentimentality, and historically has been associated with femininity, and coming from a patriarchal background, psychology tends to negate those sorts of values, instead relating more towards anthronile or this tough-mindedness, which is suggestive of a masculinity. A second reason that Fitzpatrick has identified is that it maintains certain professionalism. They don't want to have a Disney-like characterization of non-human animals. They think that's silly. However, that being said, the research before Morgan's canon happened 130 years ago, so there's not just Morgan's canon that has contributed to these different associations of animals. So the professionalism is really a bad claim. The third is uniformity and discipline. It's the suggestion that even if Morgan's canon is a bad mechanism, at least everyone's on the same page, everyone's able to operate the same way. That's why we have a strict APA style, so that everyone, all the psychological articles, will be identical in some way, even if they're all holistically inaccurate. A fourth reason is that it depersonifies the scientist's responsibilities. Scientists don't have to make a decision about the intelligence of the non-human animal. Even if the results are wrong, they can rely on Morgan's canon to do that for them, so they don't have to experience the risks of being wrong. The fifth is that opposing Morgan's canon is outside of the data. So you'd have to do a presentation like I am right now to oppose Morgan's canon, because the data we have uses Morgan's canon as an assumption. So there's no way around it except by using, criticisms outside of data. And the sixth is a broader claim of heteronormativity. And heteronormativity basically privileges a certain type of neurotype, generally the human type, the neurotypical human mind, which is a theoretical and abstract concept. The canon legitimizes the idea that deviations from the hypothetical human mind are absences. If we don't understand how these minds work, they must be lesser than, according to this, to Morgan's canon. This provides a conceptual buffer between the human and the non-human mental experiences, such that humans become peerless. There's literally no way that non-human animals can be above humans overall, because what we define as being the most complicated is what we have the most immediate access to, which is the human mind. So humans are necessarily at the top through using this Morgan's canon. Now this structure puts humans in a dominant but lonely position. Are we alone in the universe? Something that I find to be particularly a strange question, because obviously we aren't alone in the universe. We have all sorts of intelligences and minds all around us, and we don't need a telescope for that. So why do researchers still follow Morgan's canon? Part 2. Before I talked about things that were incidental to it, researchers follow Morgan's canon in spite of the way it risks underestimating non-human animal minds. But what if researchers are embracing Morgan's canon because it risks underestimating non-human animal sophistication? The resulting articles for all their productions would be an ego boost for all the human producers, consumers, and regulators of scientific research. So every aspect of the scientific process would be basically complemented by this. And the second part is it justifies their harming of animals in research, which I talked about before, and again justifies that they're getting grants and being able to continue these research processes. And the third is it acts as a buffer between researchers and the moral weight of the harms against non-human animals. It's less scary if non-human animals don't experience pain. They don't have to worry about the consequences of their actions. So what are some alternatives that we can work on right now? One alternative has been proposed by Fitzpatrick. He suggests that we replace Morgan's canon with evidentialism. I'll summarize it for you. He suggests that we should be basing all our claims off of the best available evidence. And if we don't have any claim that has better evidence than the other, we should be saying, I don't know. We shouldn't be making one claim over the other. However, there are some concerns with Fitzpatrick evidentialism. For one thing, it doesn't really oppose Morgan's canon, because Morgan's canon also suggests finding the best possible evidence. But the other aspect of it, the I don't know aspect of it, I don't find it to be particularly compelling from an ethical standpoint. Because oftentimes we would be talking in terms of psychologists would be eager to embrace this idea that we don't know much about the non-human animal. But no one's going to change their behavior based on something they don't know. And the third would be that it assumes a perspective-free objective lens, which is not only incorrect, but continues to perpetuate oppression. The fourth is that it doesn't directly address the anthropocentric bias. Can we trust scientists to be naturally just non-human animals, given their historical policy of slaughtering animals? The reason being, if they continue to say, I don't know, then we have to trust that scientists would be able to make the right ethical decision within this framework of I don't know. I'm not particularly convinced that scientists should be trusted. I'm running out of time, but I found some interesting evidence that suggests that even the guidance, the ethical guidance for non-human animals, have a very twisted sense of what it means to care for non-human animals. The ICAS guide, which is what regulates all psychological researchers to prevent abuse of non-human animals, has suggested that euthanasia is, in some studies, and really all their studies, should be planned and necessary as a means to relieve pain. They've suggested that protocols should specify a particular endpoint to these non-human animals when they exhibit certain physical and behavioral deficits to ensure that they're killed humanely whenever possible and also complete the scientific objectives. So the ICAS guide requires the killing of non-human animals based on particular behaviors resulting from the study itself. Or you could look at varied in the rhetoric of other research. This is an abstract that I read, which was supposedly for the benefit of non-human animals. It was supposedly trying to find a way to have ethical treatment of non-human animals. He was testing the effect of carbon dioxide on rats carbon dioxide being a very popular way that rats are killed. And buried in this abstract is this idea that it is the fact that he had, two sets of rats, one of whom had a certain type of CO2 death, and the other which had a different type of CO2 death. And he wanted to see if either of them would have more pain than the other. He concluded that because neither of them had more pain than the other, this type of rapid death through CO2 was humane. My question would be, if he considered CO2 to be potentially an inhumane treatment of non-human animals, then why would this researcher have had two sets of rats subjected to this type of problematic, dangerous, unethical practice? So I have a proposal for an alternative principle. That is that researchers should prioritize equal but competing interpretations of non-human animal behaviors in a way that balances respect for non-human animals' own and the related populations, autonomy, dignity, identity, and safety. And this should be a stricter version of what Fitzpatrick had offered, but from an ethical perspective. Now, one should keep in mind that the proposal I've offered is contrived. I completely made it up. But it's not any less contrived than the original Morgan's canon. Even if we don't embrace this particular model, we need to reject Morgan's canon. There are some possible benefits of this. One is that it balances directly against the anthropocentric bias. The second is that it challenges the reductive behaviorist culture and psychology. The third is that it demonstrates, as I spoke about before, that an ethical axiom is possible. It is also easily adopted by the scientific community. It probably won't be even resisted. The next one is that it provides activists with more relevant information to non-human animal minds, one that's not reductive, one that gives them the benefit of the doubt instead of having to prove each and every aspect. There are some limitations, of course. One is that it affects only equal interpretations of non-human animal behaviors. The second is that it does not directly oppose animal experimentation. The third is that it likely only affects a particular narrow field of research, and those are the people who are doing cognitive behavioral research on non-human animals.
Okay, Caleb.
So I have lots of unanswered questions. I'm sure you'll have a lot more that I can't answer. Some starting points to contextualize this and some things I might be looking to in the future. Why do researchers who know better continue to harm non-human animals? How can researchers involve non-human animal input into their methods? Because currently we reduce their voices and exclude them. And the third is, are there ethical investigations into non-human animals' minds that are possible? Are these just vanity projects? Is it even good to be thinking about these hypotheticals when the status quo is so particularly bad? And that's all I have. So I really appreciate y'all watching. Thank you so much.
Sure. I guess. Yeah, you changed it. Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Caleb, you're still there, right?
I still am.
Okay. So, if you don't mind, could we do the question and answer session right now while our other presenter is setting up? Would you mind?
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to.
Okay, great. So we'll open it up to the floor then. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Yes.
What was his first name?
Caleb.
Caleb, that was amazing. Your inspiration you're an undergraduate. Are you an undergraduate right now?
Yes, I'm an undergraduate. I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Should I stand up?
Maybe come, yeah.
Here, I'll come to the front.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Anyway, sorry. Can you hear me now? Or see me? Anyway, that was very inspirational. All right, can you hear me? Are you there? So here, let me just ask a question. Let me put on the hat of a scientist and say, what if I say this? Look, what I don't want to do in science, so I look at the data and I make an inference to the best explanation. And one of the worst things I can do is make an inference beyond the data, right? That's just bad science, right? So if I want to do good science, what I need to do is look at the data and make some kind of inference. And if I'm wrong and I have a kind of clever Hans thing going on where I make an inference beyond what the data say, then I look bad and I look like I don't know what I'm doing when I do science. So the reason why I need to use Morgan's canon is because I have to look at all the possible inferences to make and say, this is the one that's consistent with the data, but also doesn't put me in the position of making making too far a claim given the evidence, right? So I'm just wondering how you would reply to that, that kind of naive scientist question.
Sure, yeah, that's an excellent question. It's a very excellent question. So I guess I'll respond to it in a couple ways. The first is that Morgan's canon isn't necessarily, even from a scientific standpoint, the most accurate representation of a non-human animal. In some ways, the safest, because it's the way that would make sure that if you give a positive answer, that you wouldn't be wrong. So in that sense, it's very secure, it's very safe, it's very cozy. But on the other hand, if your goal is not to be wrong, if your goal is to have an overall estimation of a non-human animal, then all the things that you haven't proved, by negating those narratives, you would be having a very one-sided depiction of non-human animals. So it would end up being this minimalistic bias. The problem with that is that there are all sorts of ethical concerns with making non-human animals look as unsophisticated as evidence will allow. So I would say that probably the safer approach would be doing something like Fitzpatrick had suggested, which is find the best possible, with the evidence interpretation, and when you don't know something, say, I don't know. That was originally the advocacy I was going to offer, but thinking it through, I'm not sure that's enough, because there's lots of things that we don't necessarily know. So I think that instead of doing that, instead of assuming the least possible interpretation for no particular reason, except maybe to feel safe and the other reasons that I offered, we might as well come up with an ethical perspective. It's not any less accurate than Morgan's canon. It's not any safer, and it's not worse scientifically speaking, because Morgan's canon was completely contrived and actually creates bias. I honestly think that if we remove Morgan's canon and replace it with nothing at this point, there'd only be benefits. We'd have more accuracy. I mean, to go through some specific examples. I don't know how much time I have. How much time do I have?
None.
It's over.
Yeah, we're really short on time. We started late.
But maybe we can take another question.
Yeah, would you mind another question? If anyone.
Oh, absolutely.
Is there anyone else?
Just to clarify the point you made in answer, it sounds as if you're saying the downside of being wrong in Morgan's canon is much greater than the possible benefits of Morgan's canon being upheld. Because the downsides are a gross amount of death and suffering, and the upside is possible accuracy, not more than 50-50 chance of being correct that that animals don't experience pain, cognition, etc. Would that be a summary that you would make about the ethics of it?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that that's partially correct, but I've nuanced it. I would say that the overall accuracy would be decreased through Morgan's canon, as well as having a surplus of ethical concerns.
Right.
For an individual researcher, I think that there would be a certain safety in Morgan's canon. Because in psychology, even statistically speaking, we never prove that a hypothesis is true. We deny that it's not true. We deny the null hypothesis. So I think that also reflects on how we engage in science overall. It comes from a tradition of behaviorism. We love to deny things. We have a very, very strict standards for the things we posit as true. Now with non-human animals, this is amplified because we know so little about non-human animals. Overall, we know as a fact that our depiction of non-human animals is really, really wrong. We know that. It's just very clear. It has an incredible amount of bias. It's worse. Morgan's canon just makes overall interpretation worse. And if we get rid of Morgan's canon, we're not getting rid of science, or data, or empiricism. Morgan's canon is an interpretation for when there's equal, equal examples. For example, you can have tons and tons of evidence that a particular mental sophistication exists, but if that particular mechanism, such as, I don't know, consciousness or theory of mind, is really complex, then any alternative would be able to deconstruct it. Now, I've seen this in some examples with non-human primates. Some of the studies were called the unknown response paradigm. If non-human primates are able to know that they don't know something, then that means that they have capacity for metacognition, which is something that scientists used to think made us different from non-human animals. So that's a big deal. So there's all sorts of studies that suggest that they do. They respond the exact way that humans do. There's frequent studies. However, for each study that exists, there's another study that comes out with a very obscure, complex way that they can stretch their hypothesis to suggest that these primates would be, using a simpler mechanism like learning or stimulus response. Oftentimes, these are very, very complex. They're not parsimonious overall, but because they have the advantage of having simpler mechanisms, these interpretations outweigh the simple explanation of their having theory of mind. So these, even within those harsh mechanisms, we still have shown possible theory of mind and metacognition, but it makes it very, very hard to do so.
I would just have to add something. I'm not sure exactly if you know this, but Morgan himself did not agree with what was done with his own canon. He said, "I did not intend it to be in order to deny like complex cognitive states and mental states, and not in other animals. That's not what I meant to do at first." So he disagreed with the way it was used.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay, so we better
Thank you.
continue on. Thank you so much, Caleb. And you're going to hang around while...
Oh, I'd love to.
Okay, great. Oh, so sorry.
No, he's still there. He's still, you can talk to him.
We won't be able to see you, but we can hear you, and hopefully you can hear us, right?
Perfect. I can hear you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Okay,
Still there.
Next, we have Christine Bailey, who...
I don't know.
Turn the sound. Oh, turn the sound up. Can you turn your sound off, maybe, Caleb? Okay. Christine Bailey is a PhD candidate in philosophy at the University of Montreal in Quebec, Canada. Her presentation is Who Calls the Shots? Moral Agency in Other Animals, Challenging Human Exceptionalism. And she has published quite a few pieces of work in French that I don't know.
Forget about it.
You want to read them?
No, it's all right. I have my website if you want to see it, christianbailey.com. You can all see it there.
Yeah, the rest is just all of your wonderful titles. And then you have a lot of other articles on animals and early Heidegger's work, but the rest of it's in French, so I don't know.
Thank you.
But I apologize. But yes,
Thank you so much.
And yeah, look forward to hearing it.
So 25 minutes, it's like 4:40. Okay, I'll do it. So I want to talk today about the issue of moral agency in other animals. This topic is rarely addressed in animal ethics, and in particular by defenders of animal rights. At best, it is considered as a diversion of most pressing issues in animal liberation, and at worst, talking about animal moral agency may seem like a slippery slope, feeding the belief that animals consent to their oppression. And could even, as Mark Rowlands believes, I am completely sensitive to these concerns, but I disagree. I think they are misleading. I think we are wrong not to address the question of moral agency in other animals and to consider them as being exclusively moral patient, vulnerable individuals who can suffer and be harmed. Of course, it is important to stress the fact that there is no need to be a moral agent in order to have basic negative rights, so I agree with that. However, I think that presenting animals as being only moral patient has negative side effects. First, it blinds us to the agency and social lives of other animals. Second, it encourages an overly rationalist conception of animal agency, which doesn't take into account the crucial role of emotion in our moral lives. And finally, it encourages what I call a paternalistic approach in animal ethics, where we are always the ones who must decide unilaterally for other animals, like where we pose ourselves as rational administrators of other animals. So, if animal rights theorists do not talk about moral agency in other animals, it's not only for prudential reasons, but also because they think that other than human animals are just not the sort of beings who can have moral obligation and responsibilities towards one another. They would live their life free of any moral consideration, obligation, and expectations. The typical distinction goes like this. Other animals are moral patients and never moral agents. Moral agents are individuals who have obligations and are able to recognize and address moral claims or ethical claims. They can act well or badly and are responsible for their actions. These would be typical human adults. Moral patients, on the other way, are individuals individuals worthy of moral consideration, but not responsible for their action. That would be babies and animals. So all other than human animals are lumped in the category of irresponsible and immature children. So on the one end, we have the rational agents, and on the other, we have vulnerable selves who can be harmed but cannot be considered responsible for their actions. In other words, other animals are individuals toward whom we can behave well or badly, but they are not themselves the kind of beings who can behave well or badly. So mainstream animal rights theorists adopt what Strawson calls an objective attitude toward other animals. In a well-known paper from 1962 on moral responsibility called Freedom and Resentment, Strawson distinguishes between two fundamentally different ways of relating to others: the interpersonal or participatory attitude and the objective attitude. So the interpersonal attitude is the everyday relation to others as being from whom we expect some form of moral consideration. So with this attitude, we are directly involved in relationship with others we consider as responsible for their actions. We adopt a wide range of reactive attitudes, such as resentment and gratitude, when they fail to respect or even go beyond our expectations. The objective attitude, on the other hand, is the detached attitude we adopt toward others not as moral agents, but as individuals to be managed, controlled, educated, trained, or cared for. Most animal ethicists adopt an objective attitude toward other animals. Other animals are seen as sentient beings to be protected and managed, not as norm-responsive agents who can understand and respect the basic rules of the community. So I think this is an inaccurate and reductive conception of the lives of other social animals, which result from a remnant of unchallenged human exceptionalism. For instance, Tom Ryan claims that moral patients cannot do what is right or wrong, and in this respect, they differ fundamentally from moral agents. The idea is that there is a fundamental difference in moral agency between typical human adults and other animals. This idea is an age-old tenet of Western philosophy and religion, shared not only by anti-species thinkers, but also by human supremacists and scientists. Even evolutionary psychologists often claim that humans are the only moral animals on the planet. This article, published in Nature, claims that chimpanzees are indifferent to the welfare of unrelated group members and are not motivated by other regarding preferences. This idea that other animals live free from any moral concern reminds me of what Franz de Waal calls the Vernier theory of morality. So morality is seen as a cultural veneer imposed on a mean and egoistic animal nature. Human morality is presented as a thin cross concealing antisocial, amoral, and egoistic actions. According to this idea, our so-called animal nature must be rationally held in check by religion and moral principles. De Waal claimed that this view cannot be taken seriously according to contemporary ethological research. Empathy and reciprocity, concern for others and pro-social behaviors, are largely spontaneous and common in many other social animals, as Darwin believed. As the ethologist Mark Beacock claims, animals exhibit a repertoire of moral behaviors, including fairness, empathy, trust, and reciprocity. So many other than human animals are also social agents who do not only care about what happened to them, but also care about what happened to others with whom they live, with whom they share their lives. Franz de Waal identifies two pillars of morality, empathy and reciprocity. So empathy would be compassion, being sensitive to the emotional states of others, like we can see here with the young chimpanzee, hugging another who just lost a fight, apparently trying to console him. Reciprocity refers to a sense of fairness we can see in the interpersonal relationship of many other social animals. Fair play, for instance, is a good example of it. This is not only found in primates, but also in rats. I don't have time to detail these research, but they are, of course, unethical, but highly interesting. So, and I share completely Caleb's point about this research being unethical and me having problems using them. You probably know this video of de Waal and his colleague revealed a sense of fairness in primates. It's a very well-known video you can find on YouTube. It's a monkey is asked to do a task in exchange for a cucumber, and he happily complies, he does the task. But then you see a cage mate being rewarded by rape for the same task, and monkeys do prefer grapes to cucumbers a lot. So when asked again to do the task, he happily complies again, expecting obviously a grape. But when he receives a cucumber, he gets very angry and throws it in the face of the completely unfair researcher. So philosophers typically claim that even if animals show empathy, other regarding behavior, pro-social behaviors, they cannot be considered moral agents because they do not judge behaviors as good or bad, as being moral or immoral, right or wrong. Of course, we could challenge the idea that moral judgment is necessary to be a moral agent, but that's not what I want to do today. I want to suggest that many animals actually do make moral judgment. De Waal's experience with the monkey's visceral disapprobation of being treated unfairly seems to show that she was feeling indignation in a situation she rightly perceived as being unjust and expressed his or her disapproval at the scientist's behavior. So this does seem to indicate that other animals are able to judge behaviors as right or wrong, if they feel what Strawson calls reactive attitudes towards others. So reactive attitudes are reactions to the quality of others' will toward us, as manifested in their behavior, their goodwill or indifference or lack of concern. In typical interpersonal relationship, we expect a minimum of respect and concern, or at least no display of willful disrespect and aggression. And when others fail to meet this expectation, we experience strong emotional reactions such as resentment, indignation, and anger. When someone steps on your foot, for instance, you might feel resentment toward her because she failed to show you a minimal form of respect. You might be resentful if you think this person was being rude. If she reacts like this, for example, with contempt. But if she apologizes, and if you realize that she was pushed and didn't mean to harm you or disrespect you, your reactive attitudes, your resentment will probably fade away. Resentment fades here, not because this person is not the kind of being from whom you can expect basic moral consideration and hold responsible, but because in these circumstances, her actions were not the result of ill will. And Strawson believes that being prone to feel reactive attitudes is exactly what we mean by holding others responsible. Strawson distinguished between 3 types of reactive attitudes. So reactive attitudes are the emotional side of holding someone responsible. He distinguished between personal reactive attitudes, so visceral disapprobation of the way you have been treated. Vicarious reactive attitudes, so this would be regarding others' treatment of others. We often call this a third-party morality. Or self-reactive attitudes, this is regarding your own treatment of others, so reactive attitudes toward yourself. It seems reasonable to me to think that many other social animals are subject to reactive attitudes in dealing with others and do expect a minimal or reasonable amount of goodwill from them. Many highly social animals are sensitive to the others and tend to cooperate their willingness to help. A study showed that primates made a distinction between humans who did not help because they could not, or because they didn't want to, and they prefer humans, helpful humans, to selfish ones. Sadly, I don't have the time here to get into the details and give you a lot of examples, but I think that social animals, social animals do seem to experience reactive attitudes, and mainstream animal ethicists presuppose that it is fundamentally inappropriate to see other animals as moral and responsible beings who can behave well or badly. So but I think that we may have difficulties to think of other animals as moral agents, but they do not seem to agree with us. They seem to think they can be held responsible for their action. They seem to hold each other responsible for their actions. So my claim is that if Strawson is right, that feeling reactive attitudes is considering others as responsible agents, and if animals are prone to reactive attitudes, then other animals do relate to each other as agents with responsibilities to behave properly toward each other. It seems to me obvious that animals are subject to the personal reactive attitudes. They react viscerally to harms being done to them. Like dog play is a good example. But most people seem to think that the second type of reactive attitudes would be properly human. For instance, Jonathan A. claimed that what is this was not supposed to happen. Jonathan A. claimed that what is distinctive about human morality is the way person A will get angry at person B because of something she did to person C, a third party. But Joyce Poole, who studies elephant, explained how a young male was trying to attack a wounded female was chased away by another female. And after successfully chasing away the aggressor, the objecting elephant came back and checked on the wounded female. It is important to note that A will not be angry at B for harms done to any third party. Even in the human case, visceral reaction of disapprobation will greatly vary depending on features like familiarity, similitude, attachment, and past experiences. People are angered more easily when someone they know and love is harmed. Harms suffered by enemies are often even seen in a positive light. Of course, we could deny that this is moral because morality should be impartial, and we should condemn equally the harms, independently of whether they are done to family members, friends, neighbors, strangers, or enemies. But even if we agree on this, that morality should be impartial, the following question still stands. Are we, in our everyday lives, moral agents in a completely different sense than any other social animals? Some may think that the third kind of reactive attitude is clearly distinctive of human morality. We can blame ourselves for our way of treating others. However, there are cases where other animals do seem to feel reactive attitudes towards themselves and inhibit their own desires and preferences out of basic regard for others. In an absolutely awful experiment designed in the 60s on primates and repeated often since then on rats, researchers forced rats to press a lever to get their food, and each time they pressed it, an electric shock was given to another rat who could see and hear. Some rats preferred to let themselves starve for days before harming other rats, particularly if they knew the other rat personally. But because the apparently moral behavior in other animals are not impartial, but highly dependent on features like familiarity and attachment, many people will want to deny their moral status. For instance, Christine Korsgaard defends a Kantian approach to moral agency, and she claims that the morality of your action is not a function of the content of your intention or your emotions. It is a function of the exercise of normative self-government and critical self-reflection. Sorry. Okay. It is in the proper use of this capacity, the ability to form and act on judgment on what we ought to do, that the essence of morality lies, not in altruism or the pursuit of greater good. Likewise, Peter Singer said, the other regarding emotional dispositions cited by Deval are always limited in scope. They fail to demonstrate the feature of impartiality, that is definitive of moral concern as a normative principle. We should understand here that Korsgaard and Singer are giving a normative definition of morality, not a descriptive one. In other words, they are describing how moral agents should behave according to the particular ethical theories, and not how they actually behave. But I think we should compare apparently moral behaviors in other animals, not to our ideal moral behaviors, but to our actual moral behaviors. If we follow Korsgaard and Singer's account, of course other animals do not qualify as moral, but most human behaviors neither. We may completely accept that morality is a difficult thing and perhaps even impossible to achieve. But the question still stands. Are we moral agents in a completely different sense than other social animals? The idea that the apparently benevolent behaviors of animals fail to qualify as moral because they would be too limited in scope and restricted to group members is very common in the scientific literature. In this article, the authors argue that human altruism is unique in the animal world. It represents, they say, a huge anomaly because other animals largely restrict their altruism for kin group, for members of their own biological group. And I find this quite funny. If the criterion for moral agency is the way you behave toward others who are not members of your biological group, then, given the way we treat other non-human animals, we may be the least moral of all animals. If we claim, so my point is that if we claim that benevolent behaviors in other animals cannot be considered moral because they are restricted to members of your biological or social group, the same criterion should discredit humanists or human supremacists as moral agents. By definition, they restrict basic rights to members of their own biological group or species. Don't get me wrong. I'm completely on board with arguing that humans, and human supremacists in particular, are not as moral as they think they are. What I'm saying is that we cannot deny animal moral agency. According to some criterion, we largely fail to meet. So I think we should distinguish between two aspects of moral agency. We should distinguish between moral behavior and moral thinking. So first, moral agency is the ability to develop interpersonal relationship with other individuals, to be receptive to their experience, to care for them, to show concern for their well-being, to show reciprocity and non-responsiveness. And it involves not only empathy and reciprocity, but also the ability to learn, to behave according to implicit social norms, to distinguish between what's right and wrong, correct and incorrect in a particular social context. And the second one would be so-called rational moral reflection and or deliberation. This would be the possibility to critically reflect on your principles, your motivations, and the consequences of your actions, to argue and deliberate what is moral and just, to justify and revise your moral judgment. Animals may not be moral agents in this sense. They may not be able to theorize and debate ethical theories, but this is arguably an intellectualist conception of our own moral lives. Most of the time we do not reflect on the principles of our action and critically evaluate them, but we simply follow social norms that we have internalized through habits and socialization. In everyday life, we conform to the ordinary rules of morality, and this is sufficient to be moral agents in the largest sense. I used to think that we should see this on a continuum, as if moral reflection would be a more developed capacity than embodied moral agency. But I don't think so. I changed my mind on this. I don't think that's a good way to go, because that would mean that individuals able of doing two would be ipso facto more moral than individuals only able to do one. But is it really the case? If this was true, then moral philosophers would be better agents than regular folks who do not spend their time reflecting and debating about moral principles. But we do have tons of studies who show that moral philosophers do not behave better than most people, even if people like to think that moral reflection help us, not people, philosophers like to think that moral reflection help us become better people. But there seems to be no straightforward link between moral reflection and moral behavior. Rational moral reflection may impose on us more duties than other animals have, but this doesn't by itself make us more competent moral agents. For instance, Jonathan Haidt. So Jonathan Haidt is a moral psychologist. He tells us that he does think that eating animals is morally wrong. I'll read the quote. So, since the day I read Peter Singer's Animal Liberation, I have been morally opposed to all forms of factory farming. Morally opposed, but not behaviorally opposed. I loved the taste of meat, and the only thing that changed after reading Singer is that I talk about my own hypocrisy each time I ordered a hamburger. In this case, it is not difficult to see Jonathan Haidt as a particularly straightforward case of incompetent moral agent. He spends his time thinking about morality, and he thinks eating animal is wrong, but he still does it. He's not very different from most people who are opposed to factory farming but don't hesitate to support this industry. So the fact that people often fail to behave according to the principle they rationally accept, this undermines the idea that we are a competent moral agent simply because we can reflect on moral principles. Rational reflection does not make us de facto better moral agents than other social animals. In fact, we can even argue, and this may be the hard part to swallow, I think we can even argue that it makes us more incompetent insofar as it imposes on us more responsibilities, though we largely fail to respect them. So rational reflection and deliberation allows us to recognize duties toward others, not only toward some special others, but toward all vulnerable selves we can recognize as such. And I think that individuals with these capacities have more moral duties than those without it. But if fairly rational adults do not necessarily act according to their own rationally accepted principles, like Jonathan Haidt, why should we suppose that these people are necessarily more competent moral agents than other social animals who are not able to reflect on morality, but are nevertheless deeply empathetic individuals, sincerely concerned about the well-being of others, and highly motivated to help them? Okay. I don't have the time to talk about all the consequences of these views, of this radical change of perspective in animal ethics, but I just want to briefly present two kinds of consequences. First, I think that acknowledging that we are not the rational and autonomous moral agents we often believe may help us to make real progress towards animal liberation. As we all know, attempts and campaigns to moralize meat eating and dairy products have largely failed. I think that we have all the argument we need in order to convince people. But convincing them on a rational basis is just not enough, as Jonathan Haidt theory shows. So adopting moralistic and self-reactive attitudes towards ourselves, like Jonathan Haidt when he says he's a hypocrite, is not sufficient to make us change our behaviors. I think that rational moral reflection can make us understand and agree that what we are doing is wrong, but this is not enough to change our embodied emotional responses and social habits. Agreeing that speciesism is wrong is not sufficient to stop speciesism, like racism, because we are just not the kind of rational agents animal rights theorists sometimes take us to be. This doesn't mean that we must stop fighting against our human supremacist tendencies, but I think that we must stop focusing exclusively on individual moral responsibility and sometimes really unhealthy reactive attitudes. We would do good to rely more on what Strawson called the objective attitude and treat ourselves as morally incompetent moral agents. who needs to be managed, controlled, educated, instead of blamed and punished. This means that we must change the social practices and institutions which encourage and facilitate our behaving in ways we recognize as morally unacceptable. And in conclusion, I think that the acknowledging on the other hand that highly social animals are moral agents in their own ways could help us seeing them as members of moral communities, of moral and political communities of their own. They have a subjective good and are able to communicate it. They are sensitive to the emotional state of others with whom they live. They are not simply moral patients, vulnerable selves who can suffer, but also norm-responsive agents and social selves who care about other members of the community. They can show self-restraint, and they can learn basic rules of the community. So we may think that animals are not responsible agents, but they seem to believe they are. We may think that they cannot understand, respect, and address basic claims to others, but they seem to think they can and they should. So I think that considering other animals as individuals who can participate in a shared moral life, as Suda Nelson and Will Kimlicka put it, implies stop seeing them as being only the beneficiaries of our paternalistic decision regarding them, but as agents who can help co-constitute the basic norm of cooperation. Thank you.
Would you prefer to just continue with the question
Yeah.
format? Is that good? So
I guess.
maybe- Sure. Anybody have questions?
Questions? Yeah. Go ahead.
Thanks. That's really important insight. Yeah, and I'm just wondering if it doesn't have implications as well for how we conceptualize the movement and also the theoretical work that we're doing as part of and in support of the movement. So should we maybe be shifting? There's already the shift to theories of justice and politics, which is implied at least in this last part of your presentation. But should we also be shifting, or at least placing more emphasis on culture? Because Jonathan Haidt is a perfect example to me of how humans are not the moral species, on top of what you're just sort of emphasizing, what you've already stated yourself very eloquently, but that we are a cultural species in as much as, and to our own disadvantage and to the disadvantage of others. So it's cultural norms and conforming to those norms that actually determine behavior. Whereas for other animals, and again you alluded to this and actually made the point, it's clearly that each individual animal within a community seems to operate on the basis of a kind of organic morality that isn't undermined by social pressures necessarily in the same way that it is for human beings. I mean, I don't know the research on that, but I'm just wondering if one concrete implication wouldn't be to shift away from sort of moral philosophy, not only into theories of justice and politics, but to questions around culture, conformism, and so on and so forth.
Wow, that is a big question. I never thought about culture conformism. I'm not sure about the distinction you do also between humans and animals with the pressure to conform, to follow social norms and pressure. I would say that we are pretty much like animals in this, maybe in this case, in a certain sense. But what I would like to be pushing for more is the institutional, because I think we have all the arguments to push forward the institutional change, in the sense that when we wrote the Declaration of Basic Human Rights, like starting by all humans are, all men or born equal or something. I mean, we had slaves at that time, and women were the property of men. So clearly, I think that writing this declaration, even if it was not if it did not reflect the way in which we actually behave, help us move toward this, acknowledging that we should move toward this. And I think that with animal rights, we could do the same thing. We can pass a more institutional and declaration, like at least our moral principles and goal, and at least we would have, because we can rationally agree on this. The problem is to change behaviors, and then we could go into all the nudge stuff, like at least asking the state and public funding to stop all form of publicity and ads for the meat industry and all form of support of this. I mean, I'm not talking about putting people in jail. That's not what I'm talking about, but I'm talking about institutional pressure And as a democratic society, we are able to make these choices. I think so. Yeah.
Great talk. And so yeah, I think the moral patient, moral agent binary, so I buy everything, and Strawson, that's one of the best papers ever written in philosophy.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
So here's my worry, and you mentioned Mark Rowlands at the beginning. So that Jonathan Haidt, he forget about the perfect moral agent being more moral. I'm not worried about that. What I'm concerned about is if the sense of agency implies a certain blameworthiness. That's my concern, right? So Jonathan Haidt, he's more blameworthy than my dog, because he should know better, right? But now, if there's this shift in thinking about agency, now, I mean, most people do think to a certain extent their kids are moral agents. Like, why else would you tell your kid you know better, or why would you yell at your dog? So we already believe this, right? But the question, my fear is, going back to the Mark Rowlands thing, moral blameworthiness, that comes with agency.
Yeah.
So now what do we do when animals do things that we think they should have known better, and then all of a sudden we're in this position where paternalism and back to where we don't want to be?
I had to take this out of my talk because it was too long. But I am actually, I have some ideas, of course, about this. I think that doesn't bring us back to trials and punishment and stuff like that. Because I think we must disconnect, and also for human beings, we should disconnect responsibility from punishment. This is a very serious issue. Retributive justice is not the same as transformative justice. The will to punish people or animals is just completely irrational. We want them to do better the next time. So my claim of animal moral agency relies only that animals are moral agents in some sense, insofar as first, they acted by themselves, so we could say that this was a voluntary action. Secondly, they could have done otherwise, so that would not, you cannot blame your dog. They could have done otherwise, and they will be able to do otherwise in the future in similar circumstances. If these criteria are not there, there's no blame, or you cannot use the transformative justice approach. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. But
There's the slide, right?
That was my question too, but I feel like you've been a little sneaky in your answer here. Because you say they are moral agents, they can't be held responsible, but now you've got three really big provisos. You could drive a truck through those provisos. They're not really, because they could. How do you judge if they could have done otherwise? And was it voluntary? All of a sudden you're taking back.
No. I think that it's also the case for human beings. If human beings, like the one who stepped on your toes in the metro unintentionally, then they did not. It was not a voluntary action. They are not responsible for this action.
Yes, but the murderer, the human murderer, a torturer, you could say, well, all of them couldn't have done otherwise to some degree. They grew up in certain circumstances, their brains were oriented a certain way, they did this thing, and it could be argued they could do no otherwise. And similarly, one could say about the animal who torments the creature before it eats it, or kills in excess of its need. You say, well, he could have done otherwise, he didn't have to do that. But shouldn't that animal then be subject to punishment?
No.
Or perhaps not punishment, re-education. So have these re-education camps for all the animals who adjust their behavior, their attitude.
Yeah, I have a lot of stuff to say about this, because now we have to enter in the realm of moral communities in the plural. So that it's very hard, even in the human case, to make moral judgment across moral communities. I think that we can responsible our dog for a lot of its behaviors, but it's a lot harder for animals who are not part of our community at all. So I think there's a lot of things to say here, but I don't think I have the time to go into it. But I think that in human trials, we take into account the factors like this guy has a difficult dog bringing and stuff like that. So I don't think that, I just don't think that there should be two different methods of weighing responsibilities in this case.
Okay.
Thank you.
These are all conversations you can during lunch tomorrow. Breakfast. Never mind. Okay, our next presenter is Skye Naslund, and her presentation is Insignificant Otherness, Parasites as Companion Species. Skye is a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography at the University of Washington. Although she originally came to her research through a lens of health geography, she draws on posthumanism and critical animal studies to examine parasite-host relationships and the ways in which parasites and other non-charismatic organisms are overwritten within biomedical research and practice. Troubling the objection and disgust that are often expressed towards parasites, Nosland considers parasites as companion species and as insignificant and intimate others, challenging the exclusion of non-charismatic species from both popular and academic imaginaries of what constitutes the category of animal. Without further ado, thanks, guys. So thank you all for coming. As you can see, I'm going to be talking about parasites today. And some of you might be wondering what parasites are doing at an animal studies conference or a critical animal studies conference, but we'll get to that. So when we think about animals, we generally think about pets, livestock, lab animals, and charismatic megafauna. All animals that we choose to acknowledge in our lives, animals that we experience in a one-to-one relationship generally. Most of these animals are mammals. And they're animals that usually live at the same scale as the human. So we can encounter them sort of one-to-one. We can look at a dog and see an individual. We often name them so that Snoopy is different from Clifford, who's different from Spot. And there's a whole host of reasons why these are the animals that are discussed when we think about the animal kingdom. Namely their size, our engagement with them, the whole socio-political history that has resulted in today's zoos and the whole phenomenon that is pets. But also, non-charismatic species are generally excluded from sort of popular imaginaries of the animal. So all the animals pictured here, and I'd be willing to bet that most of the animals that have popped into your mind when you think about the word animal come from just one phylum, and that's Chordata, or animals that have a spinal cord. There are, however, 9 different phylums in the animal kingdom, 2 of which are made up primarily of parasites. So Nematoda and Platyhelminths. So while popular perceptions of what is an animal is important, just as important is what is considered an animal within academia. When we think of animal studies, what are we doing research on? And even within critical animal studies, we're primarily considering those animals that I just mentioned, pets, megafauna, farm animals, lab animals. There are some notable exceptions, though. Parasites, on the other hand, have been almost entirely absent from discussions and conversations around animals, both in popular and academic literatures. They get painted as harmful invaders, as risks to animals, including humans, as aliens, as monsters, and primarily as disease. So as Marlene Zook puts it, when people talk about parasites and their influence on us, they usually mean horror movie events, with hapless victims being taken over by ruthless pathogens and becoming mass murderers in their manipulated efforts to spread the parasite to new hosts.
Thank you.
The parasitic form has appeared in such diverse places as Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Octavia Butler's Bloodchild, Stephen King's Dreamcatcher, and perhaps most famously bursting out of the abdomen of Executive Officer Kane in Alien and the sequels that followed. So arguably worse than their depiction in these monster-sized alien forms is the fact that parasites are often ignored in academic research. So 13 out of 19 of the most commonly recognized neglected tropical diseases, named such because of the lack of research around them, are parasites. And those infected with these 13 diseases account for almost half of the human population. Even Haraway, in the Companion Species Manifesto, analyzes this image here, and I apologize if the image is not very clear, but it's a sheep herding a bunch of sheepdogs into a pen, and it's an ad for a deworming pill. So Haraway uses this image to unpack the relationships that both the sheepdogs and the sheep have with their human companions, but never once does she mention the parasite that's behind this entire image and the parasite that's being killed in the production of it. So Haraway articulates companion speciesship as those species that have shared intimacy, purpose, and history with one another, such that they impact each other's constitution and development. The companion species relationship is defined by a becoming with, in which members of companion species become significant others or unique beings that come together to produce a joint future. So even though parasites have evolved in tandem with humans, share a body with their hosts, they have yet to be considered as companion species. Instead, they're thought almost exclusively as pathogens, or organisms that do harm to their hosts, or bearers of disease, allowing us to ignore their position as animals and as unique living organisms, allowing us to ignore the geographic and to ignore the multidirectionality of such relationships. So using my own personal experience with parasites, published accounts of parasite-host interactions, analyses of parasitology textbooks, and scientific research about parasites, I argue that parasite-host relationships are indeed relationships of companion species, and that considering parasites as companion species allows us to move past our engagement with the traditional animals that are usually part of animal studies, to think about those animals that we can't see, that we don't experience on a one-to-one relationship, and that sometimes do us harm. So considering the parasite-host relationship allows us to grapple with whether companions can do us harm, how companionships are formed across scale, how companionship works in situations where we aren't really positive that the companion is even there. So further in considering parasites as companion species, the violence that's done against parasites is exposed, which in turn sheds light on the violence that's done against hosts of parasites. And I'll get more into that in a few minutes. For simplicity today, I'm going to focus exclusively on the human hookworm relationship, but this relationship is not unique amongst host-parasite relationships. So I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background on hookworms and their coevolution with humans, just to put us all on the same page. So about 10% of the global population hosts hookworms at any given point of time, and about half of the world is at risk, primarily those living in the global south. Hookworms are passed into the soil through contamination with human feces. In places where night soil is used, that is where people use human feces to fertilize crops, and in places where there are shallow latrines, either due to high water tables or rocky soil or lack of knowledge, hookworm infection is particularly prominent. So when the egg ends up in good soil, and good soil for the parasite is sandy, loamy soil, the larvae hatch and mature and migrate horizontally through the soil. They can travel about 4 to 6 feet, and every morning when the ground is wet with dew or after a rain, they come to the surface and they spin around. They kind of get up on their tails, spin around searching for a host. And they can survive like this for about a month. So when they do find a host, they burrow into the skin, usually through a hair follicle in the lower extremities and feet. And they find their way into the bloodstream. And there they just swim around until they get stuck. And the place that they get stuck is in the very narrow capillaries of the lungs. And once they feel like they're being squeezed in this narrow space, they release an enzyme that allows them to burrow into the center of the lungs, where they cause an allergic reaction that causes the host to cough, which helps them move up to the epiglottis, which is where the respiratory tract separates from the digestive tract. And then when we swallow, they end up in your digestive system and make their way to your small intestine. There they latch onto your small intestine, they mate, they reproduce, they eat intestinal lining and blood, and their eggs are passed through your body in excrement. So my rationale for going into such detail of their life cycle is to demonstrate how well evolved they are to their specific hosts. They know our human bodies better than we do. They have expert enzymes that are designed specifically for breaking down human lung tissue. They are experts at evading our immune systems, to the point where current thinking is that we actually need such parasites for proper immune system development. So as McSorley and Lucas explain, human evolution with hookworms has reached a stage where humans are relatively asymptomatic when harboring low-intensity infections, assuming reasonable nutritional status of the host. Evidence is gathering that the infection is tolerated with minimal pathology to either the worm or to the host. It seems likely that during our coevolution, the immune system is adjusted to compensate for the continual suppression of hookworm infection. Thus, in the absence of these parasites, our immune response has become hyperactive, resulting in the increase in the prevalence of immune dysregulatory illnesses in the developed world. And this concept is called the hygiene hypothesis. And it's essentially the idea that our use of antibiotics, our elimination of parasites, and our overly hygienic environments have resulted in the autoimmune diseases that are so common in the global north and all but absent in the global south. In eliminating our parasites, there's sort of two lines of thought on this. One line of thought is that by eliminating the parasites, we have eliminated what the immune system wants to attack, and so the immune system kind of goes wild and attacks the body instead. The other line of thought is that over time, through evolution, we've gotten to the point where we need that low level of immunosuppression for the immune system to function properly, because the hookworms and other parasites release these immunosuppressant chemicals. And so without that, the immune system goes haywire. So the mechanism behind it isn't fully understood, but the concept is well established. To the point where clinical trials are now underway using hookworms to treat such autoimmune diseases as irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's disease, colitis, different allergies, asthma, and this treatment is referred to as helminthic therapy. So as such, many parasites, including hookworms, can actually be considered to be mutualists in that they can, in some instances, be beneficial to their hosts. So probably the most well-known parasite companion is Jasper Lawrence. He was debilitated by severe allergies, started reading, had tried all different remedies, started reading on the internet about helminthic therapy, tried to get involved in a clinical trial and wasn't able to get in, and ended up going to Cameroon, walking around barefoot around latrines to infect himself with hookworm. It was so effective for him that he has now dedicated his life to making hookworms available for other people. So he has this whole business where he sells hookworms over the internet. He was originally selling them in the US, but after the FDA determined that hookworms could be classified as a pharmaceutical product and thus can't be sold by a layperson, he had to move abroad. But he still sells them, and 5 years worth of treatment runs for almost $4,000. So he clearly has a very intimate relationship with his parasites, and his daily happiness depends on them, and his ability to function as a human depends on having these parasites in his system. So for Haraway, companion species are those species who make us who we are. And so for Lawrence, the hookworms allow him to be himself and to live his life unconstrained by the allergies that prevented him from leaving his house. So hookworms aren't unique in this way. Many parasites quite literally fill this role in terms of breaking down our food, allowing us to digest particular enzymes, and in building our immune defenses. So can we be companions with species that sometimes do us harm? Hookworms can be very beneficial in small numbers to the host if the host is in good health. But there are for young children, for people who are malnourished, for people who have compromised immune systems, hookworms can also be very detrimental. And so I would argue that yes, hookworms can still be companions, but perhaps thinking about companionship at a species level is a little foolhardy, in that no species is going to be a companion 100% of the time and be beneficial 100% of the time. So even in the most classic example of dog is man's best friend, there are certainly instances that we've all heard about where dogs are not humans' best friends, where dogs have attacked humans. So no companion species relationship can be mutually beneficial at all times, in all places. I think it's necessary to recognize the fluid nature of these relationships and not to attempt to combine large groups of individuals and such dynamic relationships into such immovable categories. So in the case of parasites, this is particularly important because parasites as a category are defined by the relationships that they have with their hosts. So while there's various definitions of parasites, and the definition is slowly shifting on account of a lot of this newer research showing the benefits of parasites, typically parasites are considered parasitism is considered one form of symbiosis in which one party benefits at the expense of the other. And it's contrasted with pheresis, in which neither party benefits or is harmed, mutualism, where both parties benefit, and commensalism, where one party benefits but the other party isn't affected. But as we learn more about the ways in which parasites can be beneficial, and even how some species can be beneficial at certain points in the life cycle, or to certain individuals and not others, these categories end up being very misleading. Ultimately, I would say not only are they misleading, but they're also doing discursive violence, because when people hear the word parasite, they often assume that this organism is doing harm to the host, which then filters into their portrayal as monsters, as I've discussed earlier. So then, also when doctors come across parasites, particularly here in the developed world, they're often immediately treated whether medical treatment is necessary or even warranted. So is visibility a prerequisite to companionship? Most parasites are small. Hookworms begin their lives as microscopic organisms and can grow to about 1 centimeter in length. But by the time they're that big, they're inside our bodies, so we don't see them. We often never see them throughout the entire life cycle. So they challenge, even though they spend almost every moment with us, right? They're along for the ride. And so in that sense, they're perhaps our most intimate companions. But yet they challenge our perceptions of companionship, as we can't sense them in the traditional ways. So we can't see them, taste them, hear them, feel them, smell them. So as such, I think parasites offer a new understanding of what companionship means. They challenge us to consider those forms of companionship that diverge most from human-human relationships. While most examinations of companion species rest on those relationships that can approximate human relationships. Think, for example, the people who have dogs instead of children, or who treat their dogs as children. Parasites instead force us to build unique companionships, entirely independent from prior conceptualizations of relationships. So to answer the question that I posed, I think that no, visibility is not a prerequisite to companionship, and in fact it pushes us to move beyond the familiar and engage with our companions in more balanced relationships that don't privilege the senses of one species over another. So finally, in considering parasites as companion species, allows us to grapple with the question of existence. So can we be companions with organisms that we don't know we're in contact with? And parasites help us to explore this in a couple ways. First, a lot of people who have parasites don't even realize that they are hosts. In hookworm, with low levels of hookworm, most people have no symptoms. And in a double-blind medical trial in which patients were either infected with hookworms or were given a placebo, those who were infected with hookworm were shown to have positive effects in their control of Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, and inflammatory bowel disease, suggesting that we don't actually have to know whether or not we are in contact with these beings in order for our bodies to have a relationship with them. So or rather, not recognizing that we are in contact with another species does not mean that we can't be companions with them. Second, even those of us who know we've been infected do not know how our parasites are doing, whether or how many are still alive, as that's something that's really difficult to know because we don't engage with them in that way. So a couple years ago when I was traveling in Tanzania, I picked up a hookworm infection, had all the telltale signs, but it's now been 2 years, and the parasite life cycle is about 2 to 5 years. So at this point, I don't know how many parasites I have, whether they're still there, what they're doing, or whether they've passed on. Finally, on this idea of existence, a common medical delusion is referred to as delusions of parasitosis, and this is where people are convinced that they have parasites even though doctors can't find any evidence. And so this sort of thinking through what that means and what our companionship relationships are in those situations allows us to question, it has a lot of potential in terms of future examinations of such relationships as schizophrenics with their delusions, children with their imaginary friends, individuals with their fantasies, and demonstrates that we can have relationships with things even if we can't prove their existence. So beyond the academic benefit of using parasites to push forward this understanding of companion species, considering parasites as companion species also helps expose the violence that's done to parasites, both physically and discursively, by their human companions.
There's nothing.
Yeah, that's fine. Hookworms have been subject to large-scale eradication campaigns. Historically, hookworms are endemic in the southeastern U.S., and the Rockefeller Foundation launched a multi-million-dollar campaign to eradicate hookworms from the United States, and it was largely successful. So I'm not in any way, well, and this model, the Rockefeller model, is being followed by organizations such as the World Health Organization and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation today and other parts of the world. And I'm not in any way trying to suggest that we should do nothing to limit human infection with hookworm. In fact, what's really unfortunate is that those people who have the most hookworms are also the people who are least able to support a hookworm infection due to malnutrition and compromised immune systems. And instead, what I'm trying to do is encourage us to think more critically about the effects of such eradication campaigns and to recognize the violence that is being done to a particular animal species as a result. So further, as I mentioned earlier, doctors, particularly in the developed world, treat parasite infections regardless of whether the parasite is harming the host or not. Even in parts of the developing world, treating the parasite is cheaper than actually testing to see if someone has it, and so everyone is tested across the board, or everyone is treated across the board without even knowing if they've been infected. So in addition to this physical violence that's done to parasites, there's significant discursive violence that's done beyond their monstrous portrayal in sci-fi and horror films. Even within academic literature, parasites are portrayed less scientifically than other organisms. In an analysis of parasitology textbooks, those parasites that are found in the developing world were disproportionately represented in their most extreme forms and were depicted in the most monstrous ways possible. So here, this is a quote from a parasitology textbook that compares hookworms to snakes. It talks about them as coming in masses by the thousands that try to make these microscopic worms appear far more monstrous than they really are. Similarly, the image here is a very common trope in parasitology texts. Even though the hookworms, when they're full grown, are a centimeter long, their teeth themselves are microscopic. This image of the hookworm baring its teeth is seen in almost every parasitology textbook, even though it looks more at home in a sci-fi movie than in medical books. So why does it matter that we represent parasites this way? Does it matter to humans? And I would answer that yes, it does. Because the populations who are most affected by parasites end up with a lot of this discursive violence that's put on parasites being put on them. So all three of these are quotes from parasitology textbooks and talking about the populations who are hosts of hookworm. So all three of these quotes point to hookworm hosts as backward people, as having poor personal hygiene. They're being described as ignorant and not able to control where they defecate. In reality, for many of these people with high hookworm burden, defecating their crop fields is a conscious decision. It's an economic decision as it helps fertilize the soil. So similarly, high parasite burdens are used to justify global health interventions, generally by global north organizations into the global south. And I'm not suggesting that all of these interventions cannot be helpful or that they're malintentioned in any way, but I am suggesting that they often represent a form of violence being enacted on some of the world's poorest people. Parasites are used as proof for why certain populations don't have the means or cannot take care of themselves, and so we must go in and do it for them. So while I hope that you walk away with a little bit of a better appreciation for parasites, my goal is actually deeper than that, and I hope that I've inspired an openness and reflexivity about the species that we come into contact with in our daily lives that we might not have considered previously. I hope to push critical animal studies to consider those animals that aren't charismatic And I think that such considerations challenge us to think better about and to think better with animals. Because parasites are so radically different than humans, they force us beyond anthropomorphic relationships and challenge us to engage with other species in a way that does not privilege us over them. Thanks.
Just a moment for questions for Sky, or?
Sure. I had a question. When they treat indiscriminately everybody that comes in and says, I don't know whether I have hookworm or not, does this damage the human in any way? Is the treatment itself harmful?
Not for most people.
No.
I mean, it's harmful for the hookworm, but
Well, yeah,
not for most of
obviously.
the human hosts. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I have a question. I have a problem with the use of the term violence to refer to these animals, because when I talk about animals, I did use the term animal in my talk. I don't use the word animal at all because I don't refer to the scientific definition of animals. I actually use the term vulnerable selves or individual with a mind and a social a mind and a social life of their own. My argument, my idea is that I restrict violence to this case. I mean, I cannot do violence to the wall. I cannot do violence to many sorts of things. You cannot be armed in the sense that vulnerable selves can be armed. And I'm not sure in which sense you think that it's a proper application of the term violence for these animals.
Parasites aren't worthy of our protection, or
I know, I'm wondering, like, what would be your normative argument to say that we should not do like harm or violence toward animals who have probably no mental life or are not considered vulnerable self, or do you think that it can be considered vulnerable selves and that?
I
So
mean,
what would be the argument?
Following your talk, I would argue that we have no way of knowing. We don't know, and actually following Caleb's talk too, we don't know to what extent these beings are vulnerable selves, and I don't think that it's our position to make that distinction. I think that it's a very blurry line, and I'm not sure where you would put that line, but I would argue that these are living beings, and that there is a time and a place for violence against them. I think that there are plenty of parasites that if I got, and if my life was at risk, I would kill them, and I would not feel bad about it. But I think that killing some other being, if it's not doing us harm, is not morally justified. Yeah.
I guess I like to talk there, but I understand the use of the word companion. We don't mean what you said we mean when we use the word companion. We mean like a friend, somebody you play fetch with, go for walks with. Supposing we use the word friend, there's no way you can describe the nematode as your friend, because it doesn't have any of the things we need in order to have friends, unless you mean that it does this biological process. So I just wonder whether the word companion is really something to do with this. You made a very good defense for the value of hookworms, but I'm just not sure why the word companion is necessary for that discussion.
Well, I would argue that perhaps for the majority of us who are healthy individuals and who are not suffering from autoimmune diseases that can be sort of rectified by entering into relationships with parasites, companionship might not make logical sense to us. But I think that I've done a lot of research and blogs of people who are using homeopathic therapy, and they do refer to these worms as their buddies, as their friends, as their babies, and people actually form these like emotional attachments to their worms. They feel bad about killing their worms if they end up with too many. So I think that companionship, I see your point, but I think that it can also be a useful term for thinking through the relationship in terms of pushing us beyond sort of anthropomorphized relationships. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
You got 1 second.
That was scary. So, thank you for your presentation. It's kind of a follow-up, and I have the same concern. I mean, your presentation is very elegant, but it assumes a kind of sympathy with Haraway's project. And I and others in some critical illness studies are not in sympathy with it. companionship, to talk about companionship is a kind of slippage, or it's a kind of equivocal term, use of the term, because in fact, we aren't in relation with, we refer to the human hookworm relationship. My relationship with the hookworm, whatever it is, isn't that the kind of relationship that we have between two subjects, where there's reciprocity, there's risk, there's vulnerability, there's the possibility of grieving, there's loss, and all the thick phenomenological thickness that goes into relationality. And the thing is, because Haraway's a post-structuralist, all that stuff drops by the wayside, and then it's almost, it's as though it's arbitrary that we're privileging this charismatic, these things. It's not arbitrary, right? I mean, the whole point of ethical discrimination is to be able to say why we have particular relationships to particular kinds of beings based on what Christiane was saying about their ontological, capacities. Now, I actually agree with you that we should take into account the subjectivity of these beings, if they have a consciousness. I mean, years ago I used to drown fleas off of my cat, and I stopped doing it because it was so horrifying. If you drown a flea, the being will struggle the way another being will. But I guess what I kind of sum up, I would just say I don't think that we need Haraway or companion species at all to get to the question of the ethical in our relationship with parasites. I just think it's an unhelpful. I just don't think it's necessary to be taught, and that's my advice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Caleb, you got a question?
Sure. Let's see. Everybody can hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry about my booming voice earlier. I wasn't able to know if you saw me. So I guess my question would be whether there's a possible intersection between the stuff that you're talking about, because it's a very exciting talk, by the way, I really appreciate it, and discussions of ableism, potentially how we consider human parasites. As a non-neurotypical person, this is very exciting to me, because oftentimes it's conceptualization that human beings are parasites on society, that they don't have a particular utility to a particular person, and based on that utility, they should be discriminated against. And a similar sort of implication for this, the ontology of parasites that you're talking about, the non-human animals. So do you think there's such an intersection?
Absolutely. I definitely think there's intersections between this work and ableism, ability studies, disability studies. I think that particularly, even just in the language and the way that the term parasite is discursively used to dehumanize people of differing abilities or different positions within our society is not coincidental. So, yeah. Okay, so we're out of time, but I just want to thank everybody for presenting. Wonderful presentation. More sessions, another session here, another session in 140, and then in the larger room as well. So don't leave, come back. Thank you.
There's an Indian place.
Yeah, that's not good. I just had a bag of peanut butter.
But also the people who are salt. Right, yeah.
So you don't need to leave your pen.
That would be the best thing we have.
Your hands on the camera. It's recording it.
You have some tough questions. The only thing I would have said was, okay, where do we draw the line? We can't do research on primates, but rats, mice, and other vermin are okay. Where do we say no research on mammals, but we work on baby ducks and chickens? Or, okay, no, but pigs are okay. Okay, well, let's start there.
And those tough questions are
What about guppies? Do we do research on guppies? Okay, now, what about clams? Live? Where's all the lines at? These people are
No
just,
one's willing to like say where the line is.
but you're beyond
We
it.
know that
Absolutely.
yeah, they'll say you're beyond it, but they're not really to say where the line is.
Clam research. Clam
No, you're fine. You're fine.
the discovery of intersex frogs.
And a lot of people would comment like, why bother talking about animals?
Guppies.
You know, like look around.
Yeah.
Guppies are isolated from the females.
True, it's not
Yeah, just go. And you just got a giant tank.
Yeah, I work with
yeah, I mean, they're around.
Just more clarify this. I don't know where you draw the line, but I think you're beyond it.
Well, I mean, possibly chronologically, but mentally.
Well, yeah. Different types of things. Like those signs, we give generous credit to anyone over 80 who has a company with
Oh, I work with high schoolers, anticipate and write into. You might think this, but yeah. It's an 811.
Saw you yesterday?
Yeah,
Yeah. You haven't heard from him? Maybe he doesn't take her straight from the Jewish. So I'm not gonna do it.